In early 1942, Port Moresby was a small port town on New Guineas, surrounded by jungle, mountains, and dangerous seas. On the surface, it appeared insignificant. In reality, it was one of the most strategically valuable locations in the entire Pacific War. Whoever controlled Port Moresby controlled the southern gateway to the Pacific. For the Japanese Imperial Navy, Port Moresby represented the final lock in a tightening strategic vice. Its capture would place Japanese land-based aircraft within striking distance of northern Australia, threatening cities such as Townsville and Cairns. More importantly, it would sever the vital sea lanes connecting the United States to Australia, isolating the continent and removing it as a major Allied base for future counteroffensives. From Tokyo's perspective, Operation MO was not merely a regional offensive, it was part of a broader effort to consolidate the vast perimeter gained after Pearl Harbor. With Singapore fallen and the Dutch East Indies under Japanese control, the Empire sought to push its defensive line southward, transforming the Coral Sea into a Japanese-controlled barrier. Port Moresby was the keystone of that barrier. For the Allies, losing Port Moresby would have been catastrophic. Australia served as the primary staging ground for American forces in the South Pacific. Supplies, troops, aircraft, and fuel flowed through its ports and airfields. If Japan seized Port Moresby, it could dominate the Coral Sea and make reinforcement of Australia dangerously costly, if not impossible. The psychological impact alone, placing Australia under direct aerial threat, would have been immense. Geography amplified its importance. Port Moresby lay at the narrow intersection between the Coral Sea, the Solomon Islands, and the approaches to the New Hebrides. Control of this region meant control of movement. Amphibious forces, supply convoys, and carrier task forces all funneled through these waters. In a war increasingly defined by air power and logistics, Port Moresby was a natural choke point. Japanese planners believed the town could be taken quickly by an amphibious assault supported by overwhelming naval and air power. They underestimated both the speed of the American response and the growing effectiveness of Allied intelligence. What they did not yet realize was that Operation MO would become the first major test of a new kind of naval warfare, one in which carriers, aircraft, and information mattered more than battleships and big guns. Port Moresby was not just a target. It was a line in the ocean. And in the spring of 1942, that line was about to be challenged in a battle fought across jungle skies and open sea, one that would quietly redefine the future of naval warfare in the Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Imperial Navy appeared unstoppable. Victory followed victory across the Pacific, and confidence within the Naval High Command was dangerously high. Against this backdrop, Operation MO was conceived as a carefully coordinated expansion of Japan's southern defensive perimeter, designed to seize Port Moresby and solidify control over the Coral Sea. The plan was ambitious but, on paper, precise. Japanese forces would advance along two parallel axes. One element would move to capture Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, establishing a seaplane base to extend reconnaissance and air cover. The second, and more critical, force would conduct an amphibious landing at Port Moresby, supported by a powerful naval escort. This dual operation aimed to confuse Allied defenders and stretch their limited resources. At the heart of Operation MO was Japan's carrier striking force. Two of the Empire's most powerful fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were assigned to provide air superiority and destroy any American naval forces that attempted to intervene. These carriers represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation, carrying experienced pilots who had already proven their effectiveness at Pearl Harbor, Rabaul, and in the Indian Ocean raids. Supporting them was the light carrier Shoho, tasked with covering the invasion force as it moved south toward New Guinea. Though smaller and less capable than the fleet carriers, Shoho's role was vital, to shield the slow-moving transports and landing ships from air attack. Japanese planners believed this layered defense would be sufficient to neutralize any Allied response. Command of the operation ultimately fell under the strategic vision of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, though day-to-day execution was delegated to his subordinates. Yamamoto viewed Operation MO as a logical extension of Japan's earlier successes, a necessary step before larger, decisive battles could be fought elsewhere in the Pacific. The assumption was clear: American carrier forces, if they appeared at all, could be drawn into battle and destroyed. Yet beneath the confidence lay critical vulnerabilities. The Japanese underestimated Allied intelligence and overestimated the element of surprise. Radio transmissions, logistical movements, and operational planning left a detectable trail. While Japanese task forces assembled in apparent secrecy, American codebreakers were already piecing together the outline of Operation MO. As Japanese ships began to move south through the jungle-lined seas of the Coral Sea, the stage was set for a confrontation unlike any before it. Two carrier fleets were moving toward one another across vast stretches of ocean, unseen, unheard, and unaware that they were about to fight a battle where aircraft would replace battleships as the decisive weapon, and where victory would be determined without the enemy ever coming into visual range. The battlefield of Operation MO was unlike anything naval commanders had faced before. The Coral Sea was not an open, empty expanse of blue water, it was a hostile maze of reefs, islands, storms, and jungle-covered coastlines. In this environment, geography itself became a weapon, shaping every decision and magnifying every mistake. Stretching between Australia, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, the Coral Sea was riddled with coral reefs and narrow passages that restricted maneuvering for large task forces. Navigation demanded precision. A single error could cripple a ship or force a fleet to alter course, costing precious time in an operation where timing was everything. For aircraft carriers, whose survival depended on distance and positioning, the sea was both shield and trap. Weather played an equally decisive role. Sudden squalls, low cloud cover, and heavy rain were common, reducing visibility to near zero. These conditions disrupted aerial reconnaissance, delayed launches, and caused strike groups to miss their targets or miss the enemy entirely. In a battle where finding the opponent first meant survival, clouds and storms could determine victory as surely as bombs and torpedoes. The surrounding jungle coastlines of New Guinea and the Solomons further complicated the fight. Dense terrain limited ground-based observation and concealed airfields and seaplane bases. Japanese forces hoped to exploit these natural advantages, using island bases like Rabaul and Tulagi to extend their reconnaissance range while remaining hidden from Allied attack. For the Americans, geography was both a danger and an opportunity. While reefs and weather threatened navigation, they also provided concealment. Carrier task forces could maneuver under cloud cover, avoiding detection while positioning for strikes. The vastness of the Coral Sea meant that even powerful fleets could pass within striking distance of one another without ever making visual contact. Operation MO would become the first major naval battle fought almost entirely under these conditions, a war of maps, weather reports, and reconnaissance aircraft, rather than gunfire and visual signals. The Jungle Sea erased the traditional concept of a naval front line. There were no fixed positions, no clear boundaries, only shifting zones of risk and opportunity. In this environment, information became more valuable than armor, and timing more important than firepower. The Coral Sea was not merely a backdrop to the battle, it was an active participant. And as Japanese and American carriers moved through this unpredictable arena, geography ensured that the coming clash would be decided as much by nature as by human design. In the vast emptiness of the Coral Sea, the greatest challenge facing both sides was simple yet decisive: finding the enemy first. Operation MO would be won not by armor or gun caliber, but by reconnaissance, by the aircraft that searched thousands of square miles of ocean in silence, hoping to glimpse a thin column of smoke or the glint of a carrier deck. Both the Japanese and the Americans relied heavily on aerial scouting. Long-range patrol aircraft, carrier-based search planes, and seaplanes launched from cruisers fanned out at dawn, flying methodical patterns over open water. These pilots operated alone, often at the limits of fuel range, knowing that a single sighting report could trigger a massive strike, or that failure to find the enemy could doom their own fleet. Early in May 1942, Japanese reconnaissance gained an initial advantage. Seaplanes operating from Tulagi and Rabaul began reporting increased Allied activity in the Coral Sea. At the same time, American codebreakers and intelligence officers had already alerted U.S. naval commanders that a major Japanese operation was underway. As a result, American carriers USS Lexington and USS Yorktown were already moving into position, unseen but ready. The first clashes were indirect but telling. On May 4, American carrier aircraft struck Japanese forces at Tulagi, damaging ships and aircraft on the water. Though tactically limited, the raid signaled a critical fact: American carriers were closer and more aggressive than the Japanese had anticipated. The element of surprise was slipping away. Still, confusion reigned. Both sides misidentified targets, mistook support ships for carriers, and launched strikes based on incomplete or incorrect reports. In one of the defining features of the battle, aircraft would often attack enemy forces that were not where commanders believed them to be. These errors were not failures of skill, but consequences of fighting a war across immense distances with limited real-time information. The Coral Sea became a battlefield of false contacts and missed opportunities. Carriers maneuvered constantly, changing course to avoid detection while attempting to position their strike groups for a decisive blow. Every reconnaissance report carried enormous weight, and every delay increased the risk of being found first. Operation MO had now crossed a critical threshold. The enemy was no longer theoretical. The eyes in the sky had made contact, and the race was on, not just to strike, but to strike correctly. What followed would prove that in modern naval warfare, information itself could be lethal. On the morning of May 7, 1942, the first decisive blow of Operation MO was struck, not by battleships, but by aircraft launched from unseen carriers. It would mark a historic moment in naval warfare, the first sinking of a Japanese aircraft carrier in the Pacific War. Japanese forces, advancing toward Port Moresby, believed their invasion fleet was adequately protected. At its center sailed the light carrier Shoho, tasked with providing air cover for the transports. Though smaller and slower than Japan's fleet carriers, Shoho was essential. Without her aircraft, the invasion force would be exposed to attack from the air. American reconnaissance aircraft located the Japanese covering force earlier that morning. Within hours, strike groups from USS Lexington and USS Yorktown were airborne, carrying a mix of dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. The pilots flew at extreme range, guided by fragmentary reports and dead reckoning, knowing that failure to find the target would mean ditching at sea. When the American aircraft finally broke through the cloud cover, Shoho lay below, small, isolated, and vulnerable. The attack was immediate and overwhelming. Dive bombers plunged almost vertically, releasing bombs that tore through the flight deck and detonated deep within the ship. Torpedo bombers followed, launching from low altitude as Japanese anti-aircraft fire struggled to respond in time. Hit repeatedly, Shoho was quickly engulfed in smoke and flame. Fires raged uncontrollably, aviation fuel ignited, and damage control efforts collapsed under the intensity of the assault. Within minutes, the carrier was mortally wounded. As she began to sink, American pilots radioed the now famous message, "Scratch one flat top." Shoho capsized and disappeared beneath the surface, taking hundreds of sailors with her. The psychological impact of the sinking was immediate. For the first time, the Japanese Navy had lost a carrier in combat, and the illusion of invulnerability surrounding its carrier forces was shattered. Tactically, the destruction of Shoho forced Japanese commanders to pause the Port Moresby invasion. Strategically, it signaled a profound shift. The battle was no longer about surface ships escorting landings, it had become a carrier duel, where air power alone would decide the outcome. The Coral Sea had claimed its first major victim, and with Shoho gone, both sides now understood the true nature of the war they were fighting. The decisive phase of Operation MO was about to begin. After the sinking of Shoho, Operation MO entered a phase that had no historical precedent. Two opposing fleets, each centered on aircraft carriers, were now hunting one another across the vastness of the Coral Sea, yet neither side could see the other. This was naval warfare transformed. The decisive weapons were no longer guns or armor, but aircraft, timing, and information. On May 8, 1942, both the Japanese and American task forces launched massive search operations at dawn. Pilots flew hundreds of miles over open ocean, scanning empty horizons. When contact reports finally came in, they were often incomplete or inaccurate. Yet commanders had no choice but to act. Waiting meant risking being struck first. Once sightings were confirmed, both sides launched full-scale airstrikes almost simultaneously. From the American carriers USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes rose into the sky. At the same time, Japanese strike groups launched from Shokaku and Zuikaku, carrying some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The two strike forces passed each other in midair without knowing it, an eerie symbol of the new age of war. The attacks unfolded in rapid succession. Japanese aircraft found the American carriers first. Lexington was struck by torpedoes and bombs that ruptured fuel lines and triggered massive internal explosions. Fires spread through the ship, turning her into a floating inferno. Yorktown was also hit, suffering serious damage but remaining operational through extraordinary damage control efforts. American aircraft, in turn, located the Japanese carriers. Shokaku was hammered by multiple bomb hits that shattered her flight deck, destroyed aircraft, and killed or wounded large numbers of crew. Though she remained afloat, her ability to conduct flight operations was effectively crippled. Zuikaku, protected by weather and evasive maneuvering, escaped direct damage, but at a cost. Many of her aircraft and experienced pilots were lost. What made the battle extraordinary was its absence of direct ship-to-ship combat. At no point did the opposing fleets exchange gunfire or even come within visual range. Every blow was delivered by aircraft operating at the edge of their range, guided by imperfect intelligence and fading fuel reserves. The Battle of the Coral Sea proved that control of the air now meant control of the sea. Battleships had become secondary, carriers were the decisive instruments of naval power. Operation MO had redefined warfare, demonstrating that future battles would be fought not by fleets in sight of one another, but by aircraft striking from beyond the horizon. As the smoke cleared on May 8, 1942, the outcome of Operation MO was still uncertain. No decisive annihilation had occurred, yet the Japanese carrier force had suffered damage that went far beyond what was immediately visible. The battle's true consequences lay not just in ships sunk, but in aircraft destroyed and pilots lost, resources Japan could not easily replace. The fleet carrier Shokaku bore the scars of American dive bombers. Her flight deck was torn open by multiple bomb hits, elevators were wrecked, and hangar spaces burned fiercely. Though she remained afloat and capable of movement, Shokaku was effectively removed from combat. She could no longer launch or recover aircraft and was forced to withdraw for extensive repairs. Zuikaku, on the other hand, escaped direct damage thanks to cloud cover and skillful maneuvering. On the surface, she appeared unscathed. In reality, her air group had been shattered. Many of her aircraft were shut down during the attacks on the American carriers or lost to fuel exhaustion on the return flight. Worse still, a significant number of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and early Pacific victories, were gone forever. This imbalance created a critical strategic dilemma. Together, Shokaku and Zuikaku formed one of the most powerful carrier teams in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, one carrier was damaged beyond immediate use, and the other lacked the trained aircrews necessary for effective operations. Even though both ships survived, the force as a whole was combat ineffective. The consequences would soon echo far beyond the Coral Sea. Only weeks later, Japan would face the decisive Battle of Midway. Because of their losses during Operation MO, neither Shokaku nor Zuikaku could participate. Japan would enter that battle with a reduced carrier force, one that would prove unable to withstand the American ambush. Operation MO thus delivered a quiet but devastating blow. It did not end with the dramatic sinking of multiple carriers, but with something far more damaging: the erosion of Japan's elite naval aviation arm. In the calculus of carrier warfare, trained pilots were as valuable as ships themselves, and in the skies over the Coral Sea, Japan had lost both time and irreplaceable experience. Though Zuikaku steamed away and Shokaku survived her wounds, the Imperial Navy had suffered a defeat that would only become fully visible in the months to come. The Jungle Sea had claimed its price, and the balance of power in the Pacific was beginning to shift. Operation MO concluded without the dramatic imagery of a decisive fleet annihilation, yet its true importance lay far beyond sunk tonnage or damaged hulls. Strategically, it marked the first irreversible fracture in Japan's momentum across the Pacific. For the first time since December 1941, a major Japanese offensive operation had been halted outright. Port Moresby did not fall. The southern advance toward Australia was stopped. And with that single outcome, the entire strategic geometry of the Pacific War began to shift. Japan's original intent behind Operation MO was ambitious and far-reaching. By capturing Port Moresby, the Imperial Japanese Navy sought to isolate Australia from the United States, severing the Allied supply artery that ran across the South Pacific. Had the operation succeeded, Australia would have been placed under direct threat, politically destabilized, strategically constrained, and potentially neutralized as a forward Allied base. Instead, the failure at the Coral Sea ensured that Australia remained a secure launching platform for future Allied offensives, transforming it into an unsinkable aircraft carrier that Japan could never eliminate. The battle also revealed a fundamental transformation in naval warfare, one that neither side fully grasped beforehand, but both would be forced to confront afterward. For the first time in history, a major naval battle was decided entirely by aircraft, with opposing fleets never coming into direct visual contact. Battleships, once the arbiters of sea power, were reduced to supporting roles. Cruisers and destroyers maneuvered, screened, and suffered, but the decisive blows were delivered from the air, over vast distances, by pilots who never saw the enemy ships they destroyed. This realization reshaped doctrine on both sides. The carrier was no longer an auxiliary weapon, it was now the core of naval power. Control of the sea had become inseparable from control of the air. Radar, reconnaissance, strike coordination, and pilot training mattered more than armor thickness or gun caliber. Operation MO was not just a battle, it was a proof of concept for the future of warfare at sea. For the United States Navy, the Coral Sea was a paradoxical experience, a tactical draw that felt like a strategic victory. The loss of USS Lexington was devastating, an irreplaceable blow in a navy still desperately short of carriers. Yet the battle proved something far more valuable than material preservation. American forces could fight Japan on equal terms. Japanese carriers were no longer invincible. Japanese pilots could be intercepted, disrupted, and destroyed. Most importantly, U.S. naval aviation demonstrated adaptability under fire, learning in real time, correcting mistakes, and coordinating increasingly complex strike packages under chaotic conditions. American commanders also gained hard, painful lessons. Early strike coordination was flawed. Communication gaps between carrier groups cost opportunities. Fighter direction and reconnaissance coverage were inconsistent. But these lessons were absorbed at extraordinary speed. The experience gained during Operation MO flowed directly into preparations for Midway, where many of the same pilots, commanders, and aircrews would fight again, this time with decisive results. For Japan, the consequences were more severe and more subtle. On paper, Japanese losses appeared acceptable. One light carrier sunk. One fleet carrier damaged. Several aircraft lost. But the true cost lay beneath the surface. Experienced aviators, the irreplaceable elite trained through years of rigorous pre-war instruction, were gone forever. Unlike the United States, Japan lacked the industrial capacity and training pipeline to replace skilled aircrews at scale. Each pilot lost represented not just a casualty, but a permanent reduction in combat effectiveness. Equally damaging was the psychological shift. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its doctrine around short, decisive campaigns, rapid expansion followed by negotiated settlement. Operation MO exposed the flaw in that thinking. The Allies did not collapse. They adapted. They absorbed losses and returned stronger. Japan had entered a war of attrition it could not win, even if its ships continued to score tactical successes in individual engagements. The battle also foreshadowed the unraveling of Japanese strategic cohesion. Coordination between naval and army objectives remained fragile. Overconfidence in night combat, torpedo superiority, and pilot skill masked deeper vulnerabilities. The assumption that technological or tactical excellence alone could compensate for limited resources would prove fatal as the war dragged on. In hindsight, Operation MO stands as a hinge point in the Pacific War, not loud, not glorious, but decisive. It slowed Japan's advance at the very moment when momentum mattered most. It preserved Australia as an Allied stronghold. It validated carrier-centric warfare. And it prepared the United States Navy, psychologically and operationally, for the battles that would follow. What came next, Midway, Guadalcanal, the long and grinding island-hopping campaign, was built directly upon the foundations laid in the Coral Sea. Operation MO did not deliver victory. It delivered direction. From this point forward, the Imperial Japanese Navy would increasingly fight to delay defeat, while the United States began its steady, methodical advance across the Pacific. The jungle sea around Port Moresby, once perceived as a shield for Japanese expansion, became instead a warning, a place where ambition met resistance, and where the balance of power quietly began to turn.